Nearly 9 months of continued escalation along the border, bringing the entire country to the brink once more. These are 3 updated scenarios I see playing out, and none of them are good for Lebanon. The first scenario, from my limited viewpoint, is the least likely scenario, which is full-out war, where the Israelis invade Lebanon and occupy geography and push people north. Pushing people north the way they used to, in the 70s, 80s, where you have civilians fleeing the south and heading to Beirut seeking refuge, like 2006. I don't see this happening. I don't think the Israelis want to get tangled in Lebanon the way they used to. It doesn't mean the Israelis don't want war, but they don't want that type of war. And it's hard to imagine Lebanese civilians under Israeli occupation again. Geography, perhaps, but not population. I don't see it, let alone the death toll. Hezbollah fighters have been on the battlefield, have been on several battlefields. Hezbollah's capabilities have grown. I think that kind of situation is what the Israelis want to avoid, which is being sucked into a bloodbath in Lebanon. The second scenario, more likely than a full-on war, but not necessarily good for Lebanon, and that's a regional deal. A regional deal that hands Lebanon for the long term to Iran. And what does that actually mean? Iran's security interests in the region are settled. They are handed Lebanon's geography. Lebanon becomes their battlefield. You may not have fighting in that arrangement. That's what happened. From August 2006, after 1701's implementation, all the way to October 2023. Calm in the south doesn't mean Lebanon is no longer a battlefield. It just means Iran is not fighting Israel or Israel is not bombing Lebanon. But that type of calm is what can kill aspirations. It can destroy political movements. It can decimate uprisings too. That's been the history, the last 2 decades of what happened to this country. Stability doesn't mean prosperity, especially when stability is achieved through political violence like Hezbollah. But you could well see things that don't appear to be problematic. You could see decent people occupy higher positions once more. You could see a president emerging from a group that we don't expect, somebody who's actually reasonable. You can see a prime minister too coming on a reform mission. But the terms of what they can do, they're shackled from the start because they cannot fully regain control over this country's destiny. They're given marginal maneuvering space. And this is how politics played out in Lebanon, especially after the civil war ended. And you have a country that wobbles, once again, but a country that cannot reclaim much more, other than calm. But that type of calm could actually spell out the permanent death of Lebanon's independence. The third scenario, in my opinion, the most likely, continued conflict, where the Israelis and Hezbollah fight each other in the south, and the Israelis may enter Lebanon. They may hold geography, they may occupy stretches of land. They will use that to pressure and to push Hezbollah north, but this will be on Israel's terms. This is what brings the worst consequence in the end, which is the re-legitimization of 2 things. War in the south, and a permanent one, a war zone that was meant to stop in 2000. It brings war back to the south and it makes it normal. The second thing is it re-legitimizes Hezbollah. By Israel entering this country and potentially occupying, whether it's geography without people doesn't matter. The fact is the Israelis are in. Most Lebanese will accept that Hezbollah is resisting Israel's occupation. People will forget why Israel entered. People will forget what Hezbollah did on October 8. It doesn't matter. The point is, Israel is here. That means everything that happened after 2000 is forgotten. Meaning, how the July War ended doesn't matter. No Lebanese voice willing to engage Hezbollah, willing to stand up for Lebanon's interests while negotiating with Hezbollah, that's gone. Instead, you have a situation where Iran is in many ways the de facto player when it comes to Lebanon's security. And Lebanese politicians manage. And they manage according to Iran's terms, and they're given some space to operate otherwise. But the south is a battlefield for Israel and Hezbollah and Iran. And I think that's the win-win situation, where Lebanon is permanently a battlefield for regional war. That this is simply a continuation of 1969, where you have groups beyond state control determining the fate of this country, and determining not just security and foreign policy, determining peace and war. 34 years after the civil war ended, 20 years after Syria left Lebanon, and 24 years after Israel's withdrawal. We're waiting for Iran. And how we wait for Iran, I think, will spell the future of this country, meaning it is increasingly acceptable to imagine a security partition of sorts emerging long term, because communities in this country will not tolerate what has happened for long. They've adjusted. Sectarianism is ugly right now, and the type of violence that's emerging is reminiscent of any society on the breakdown. That's how Lebanon fell apart in the 1970s. This is what's happening today. How long Hezbollah can handle this, I don't know. But the rest of the country will not accept. And what that means in the end could actually end up being a partitioning of the country that's unexpected right now, but nothing peaceful. This ends in violence. In the 1960s, the Lebanese kids that would later become militiamen were not born to fight Arafat or Fatah. They ended up fighting Arafat and Fatah, and they were training in the mountains in the 1970s, taking security measures into their own hands. But there's nothing in our DNA that means a Kataib kid in the 50s or 60s is going to kill Palestinian fighters or Lebanese Muslims in the 1970s and 80s. That's how things degenerate. And we're at the beginning of that journey once more. But those are the options Hezbollah left Lebanon with. And those are the options we're actually playing with right now. I don't think Lebanese will handle the status quo much longer. Divorce in this country will never be through peace and referendum and a meeting of elders to see that we can't live together anymore. Unfortunately, if we're heading to divorce, we're also heading to civil war.